doctor takes his son by the hand and leads him toward a locked door beneath their house. He is a quiet man, a healer, not a fighter, and he is about to hand the boy the truth of the entire world, the reason the giants exist and what truly waits beyond the walls. He promises to show him everything, and in the exact moment before that door can be opened, a giant taller than the wall appears overhead, the town is torn apart, the boy's mother is eaten in front of him, and the father vanishes into the chaos with the key still in his pocket. The truth stays sealed in that basement for years, while an entire army bleeds itself thin to reach one ordinary room. That is a single morning in Attack on Titan, and the story keeps burying mornings exactly like it, quiet and then suddenly total. Tonight is a slow walk through the secrets buried beneath all of it. Welcome to Anabrain. Let's get started. Section 1. The World Beyond the Wall. For most of the people living inside the walls, the world was a small and settled place, and that smallness was its own quiet comfort. There were 3 great rings of stone, one set inside the other, and within them sat every town, every field, every river, and every person that anyone alive had ever known. Outside the outermost ring, there was only ruin and giants. The giants had no clear purpose. They roamed the empty country beyond the stone, and on the rare days they reached a living human, they swallowed that person without hunger and killed without any visible anger. This was simply how the world worked, and it had worked this way for over 100 years. Generations were born, grew old, and were buried in soil they never once left. A child in the innermost district could live an entire life without ever standing in the shadow of the outer wall, let alone seeing what lay past it. The walls were tall enough to blot out the horizon, and so the horizon stopped being a thing people thought about. Comfort settled over the population like a heavy blanket. Inside the deepest ring, the wealthy and the powerful slept soundly, sure that the stone would hold forever and that the giants would never come close enough to matter. A small number of people refused to accept that the wall was the edge of everything. Among them were 2 boys from a town in the outermost ring, in a southern district that jutted out from the wall like a small tooth. One of these boys carried a quiet obsession with the world he had never seen. He kept a book that was supposed to be forbidden, a book that described oceans of salt water so wide that no shore could be seen across them, fields of ice, mountains of flame, and stretches of sand that went on without end. To most of the people around him, wanting these things was foolish and even dangerous. To him, the desire to walk outside one day was the only thing that made the inside bearable. That ordinary peace ended in a single morning. In the year the calendar inside the walls marked as 845, something appeared above the outer wall that should not have been possible. A titan taller than the wall itself, its body stripped of skin so that the muscle showed raw and steaming, looked down over the top of the stone. Moments later, the outer gate of the southern district was destroyed by a single kick, and the giants that the people had kept locked outside for a century came pouring in. The outermost ring was lost that hundreds of thousands of people were either eaten or forced to flee inward, and the safe little world cracked down its center. For the boy who dreamed of the sea, that day took something far more personal than a wall. His mother was killed in front of him, pinned beneath the rubble of their home, and then lifted into the mouth of a wandering titan while he was carried away by a family friend. His father, a doctor named Grisha, had been away from the house. When Grisha returned to the broken district, he found his son alive, and not long after that, the father did something strange that would haunt the rest of the story. He led the boy into the family basement, or rather he spoke of it, and he made a promise. There was a truth kept in that basement, a truth about the world and about the Titans, and one day the boy would be shown all of it. Grisha had a key. He pressed the importance of that basement into his son with an intensity that did not match a simple family secret. Then the father vanished. He gave his son an injection, an act the boy could not understand or remember clearly, and after that Grisha was simply gone. The basement remained locked. The key remained, but the district that held the house now sat in the ruined zone outside the second wall, deep in giant territory completely out of reach. For years, that locked door became the single quiet question humming underneath the entire war. Whatever Grisha had hidden was supposed to explain everything, and no one could get to it. The soldiers who fought the giants knew about the basement, the branch of the military that ventured outside the walls, the one that took the heaviest losses by far, eventually turned the recapture of that lost southern district into a central goal. They were not merely trying to win back land and farms. They were trying to reach one ordinary house with one ordinary basement, because the strongest hint anyone had about the nature of their enemy sat behind that door. The path to it was paved with an almost unimaginable number of deaths. To even approach the house, the soldiers had to retake the entire outer territory, fight through the titans that filled it, and survive the human enemies who, it turned out, were waiting among them. That longer story belongs to later section. What matters here is the simple shape of it. An entire army bled itself thin over years for the contents of a single room. When the soldiers finally fought their way back into the ruined district and reached the old house, the building was a shell. The upper floors had collapsed long ago. The basement, though, was intact. The lock that had sealed it for years gave way, and the survivors descended into a cramped underground room that smelled of dust and old paper. For a few moments, there was almost nothing to see. Then a hidden compartment in the doctor's old desk was opened, and inside it lay the answer the entire series had been circling since its first minutes. There were books, 3 of them, written in the doctor's hand, and resting with them was a single photograph. The photograph alone was enough to break the old world. The people inside the walls had no such technology. A clear, captured image of real human beings was, to them, something close to impossible. And yet here was one, showing a man, a woman, and a small child standing together in clothing no one inside the walls had ever worn. The man in the picture was the missing father, younger, with a family that had nothing to do with the family he raised in the Southern District. The mere existence of the photograph said something enormous before a single word of the journals was read. Somewhere out there, beyond the giants and the empty country, was a civilization. People were living. Cameras were being built. The world had not ended at all. The journals filled in the rest, and what they contained reshaped everything the audience thought the story was about. The land inside the walls was not the last refuge of mankind. It was an island, a single body of land surrounded by sea, called Paradis. Far across that sea lay the wider world, full of nations and armies and ordinary towns. And chief among those nations was a powerful country called Marley. The people inside the walls were not simply humans. They belonged to a particular group called Eldians, the descendants of an ancient empire. And to most of the world beyond the sea, Eldians were not victims to be pitied. They were regarded as a race of devils, blamed for ancient crimes, feared and hated, and held responsible for the existence of the Titans themselves. The journals went further still, into the personal history of the man who wrote them. Grisha had not been born inside the walls. He had grown up far away in Marley, penned into a sealed district set aside for Eldian, a kind of internment zone where his people lived under heavy restriction and constant suspicion. As a boy, he had watched the cruelty of that life up close. His younger sister slipped beyond the boundary one day and the truth of what happened to her marked him for the rest of his life. That grief pushed him toward a hidden movement, a group of Eldians who dreamed of restoring their lost empire and freeing their people. They gathered in secret, traded forbidden knowledge about their own history, and quietly worked against the country that caged them. The records explained the central horror that people inside the walls had never suspected. The Titans were not a separate species, they were Eldian. The wandering giants in the empty land outside the walls had once been human beings, people who had been transformed against their will into mindless, hungry creatures. The method was a deliberate punishment. Eldians judged as criminals or traitors by Marley were exiled to the island of Paradis, and on the way they were turned into ordinary Titans and set loose to roam. The enemy that had eaten the boy's mother, the enemy that had terrorized the walls for a century, had human faces buried somewhere beneath the muscle. Every giant outside the stone was in some sense. Grisha's movement was eventually betrayed and crushed, and most of its members suffered exactly that fate, marched onto the island and twisted into Titans one by one. The doctor survived only because of a single hidden ally. Among the Marleyan officials overseeing the punishment was a man secretly working for the Eldian cause, an infiltrator who had buried himself deep inside the enemy's own ranks and passed information to the resistance for years. This man carried something rare and dangerous. He held one of the special Titan powers, a power that did not turn its bearer into a mindless monster, but instead granted a controllable, intelligent giant form. With his own time running short, this hidden ally chose Grisha as his successor. He handed the power over, gave the doctor a mission to reach the walls and uncover the secrets of the royal family ruling there, and sent him toward Paradis with the future of an entire people resting on his shoulder. So the man who locked the basement was far more than a town doctor. He had crossed the sea carrying a stolen power and a desperate plan, married into a family inside the walls, raised a son, and written down everything he knew in case he failed to deliver it himself. The promise he made to that son in the ruined district was the promise of this exact truth. The basement did not hold treasure or a weapon. It held the history of the world, written plainly, waiting for someone brave enough and lucky enough to reach it. The consequences of this single discovery reached into every corner of the society inside the walls. The comfortable belief that they were the last survivors of a dead world collapsed. In its place came a far heavier knowledge. The real danger had never been only the giants in the field. The real danger was the rest of humanity, an entire planet of people who saw the Eldians of Paradis as monsters that deserved to be wiped out completely. The population that had been kept ignorant for 100 years now had to absorb the fact that their ignorance had been engineered, that someone had deliberately sealed them inside a small world and erased the larger one from their minds. The reasons behind that and the figure responsible for it sit at the heart of mysteries explored in later sections. Across the sea, in Marley, the official version of this history had long been taught as settled fact, woven into propaganda and pushed onto Eldians and Marleyans alike. Years after the basement was opened, that version would be announced openly to a watching crowd by a prominent Marleyan figure during a public spectacle, confirming for the wider world the same broad shape of events that Grisha's journals had revealed in private. The two accounts did not match perfectly in spirit or in sympathy, and the gaps between them would matter a great deal. The bones of the story, though, were the same. One small island, surrounded and despised. One ancient people, blamed for a power they could barely understand. One locked basement that, when finally opened, turned a survival story into something far larger and far sadder. The geography of it all settled the last piece into place. Paradis was a dot of land near the bottom of the map, isolated by water, while Marley loomed as a vast military power capable of crossing the sea and striking whenever it chose. The walls had never been the boundary between humanity and extinction. They had been the boundary between one frightened, hidden people and a world that wanted them gone. Everything the early chapters presented as a simple fight for survival against faceless monsters was underneath the opening move in a far older and far more human conflict. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the walls were never the true edge of the world, only a curtain drawn carefully across it, and the truth behind that curtain stretched back far further than anyone inside had ever guessed. To understand how a handful of giants came to hold the fate of everything, the story has to travel back to a single girl, an ancient tree, and the strange and silent thing that waited beneath its root. Section 2. The First Titan and the Origin of It All. Every power in this story, every giant, every walled city, every war fought across the sea, can be traced backward along a single thread until that thread ends at one person. Before her, the world held no titans. There were no walls made of bodies, no soldiers turning into monsters, no royal families guarding ancient secrets. There was only ordinary land and ordinary people living and dying the way people always had. The entire long nightmare that follows grew from one quiet moment that happened more than 2,000 years before the fall of the Southern District. In a corner of the world, the story shows only in fragments. The person at the center of that moment was a girl named Ymir. The records kept inside the walls remembered her in two very different ways, and the gap between those two memories is its own small mystery. The version taught, almost as scripture described, a gentle and selfless founder, a girl who received a wonderful gift and used it to serve mankind, building roads and bridges and bringing prosperity wherever she walked, before passing peacefully and leaving her power behind for the good of her descendants. A young member of the royal family once repeated this gentle account to her little sister, describing Ymir as kind and always thinking of others before herself. It was a comforting story, the kind told to children, smooth and polished until nothing sharp remained. What the series eventually shows is far bleaker, and it strips away the comfort almost entirely. More than 2,000 years ago, in a time of small tribes and constant raids, Ymir lived in a village that had the misfortune of being conquered. The conquerors were a people called the Eldians, led by a man named Fritz, and when they took the village, they took its people too. Ymir was made a slave, one body among many, owned rather than known. Her days belonged to others. Her name barely mattered. No one asked what she wanted, and it is likely that for most of her life, no one ever had. That detail, simple as it sounds, turns out to sit underneath the whole tragedy of the series, though its full weight does not land until the final chapters. The event that changed everything began as cruelty dressed up as sport. By the account the story presents, some of the king's pigs escaped their pen, and Ymir was blamed for setting them loose. Whether she truly did it hardly matters. As punishment, she was released into open country and then hunted, chased down by armed men and dogs as though her terror were a kind of entertainment. An arrow found her. Bleeding and desperate, she ran until she reached an enormous old tree, and there she fell. Beneath the roots of that tree was a hollow, and beneath the hollow was water, and she dropped down into the dark. What waited at the bottom is the thing the series can never fully define, and the story itself admits as much. The records give it a careful, almost cautious name. They call it the source of all living matter. It appeared as a strange, pale, worm-like creature, long and limbless in the way it moved, with a cluster of feelers where a head might be, something a later character would compare to a glowing centipede. It had no clear eyes and no clear mouth. It seemed ancient beyond reckoning. The great tree above it had grown to its towering size precisely because the creature lay below, quietly reshaping the living things around it. When Ymir fell into that pool of water, the creature found her, and it joined with her body, fusing to her spine. In that instant, the power of the Titans, Ymir rose from the water transformed, her broken body healed and made enormous, and she became the first Titan the world had ever seen. The exact nature of what happened to her is left deliberately unsettled by the story. The series never tells the audience plainly what the creature truly was, whether it was the literal origin of all life on the planet as its name suggests, or some far stranger thing wearing the shape of a living organism. One of Ymir's distant descendants would later guess that the whole grim design, the giant indestructible bodies, and the strange path to a deathless existence grew out of Ymir's own terror and her longing to never be vulnerable again. That idea is presented as a theory spoken by a single character rather than as settled fact, and the story leaves room to doubt it. What is certain is the result. A frightened, hunted slave girl became something close to a god, and she had no idea what to do with it. She returned to her master. With her new power, she served King Fritz exactly as she had served him before, only now she could move mountains. She cleared forests and tilled fields in moments. She built bridges across rivers and roads across the land. And when the king wished to expand his domain, she became his weapon, marching against his enemies and crushing them under a body no army could stop. The Eldian Empire grew vast and feared on the strength of one person who had never once been asked whether she wished to do any of it. She bore the king 3 daughters, and those daughters were named Maria, Rose, and Sina. Long after, when a different people raised 3 great rings of stone to hide behind, they would name each wall after one of these 3 girls, though almost no one inside those walls would ever know why. For 13 years, Ymir held the power and served without complaint that the story ever shows. Then she died, and the way she died says a great deal about the life she had. In a moment of sudden danger, a blade was sent flying toward King Fritz, and Ymir threw her own body in front of it without hesitation. She took the wound meant for the man who had enslaved her, and it killed her. Even her death was an act of service to someone who had never treated her as a person. There was no reward waiting for that loyalty. As she lay dying, the king felt no grief for herself. He felt only the loss of the power she carried, and he was determined not to let it slip away. What he did next set the entire machinery of the series in motion. He commanded his 3 young daughters to eat their mother's body. The girls obeyed, consuming Ymir's remains so that the power inside her would not vanish but pass into them instead. The single power that had lived in one person was now divided, carried forward through her own children, and from that terrible meal, the long inheritance of the Titans began. Maria, Rose, and Sina would each pass their share of the power down through their own descendants in turn. And over centuries, the power would branch and settle into 9 distinct forms. That story belongs to the next section. What matters here is the moment of division itself, a mother devoured by her daughters on the order of the man she died protecting. Ymir's death did not actually free her. This is, perhaps, the strangest and saddest part of the whole origin. Her body died, but her will, her consciousness, the deepest part of who she was, did not pass on with it. It went somewhere else, into a vast and timeless place the story calls the Paths. The Paths are difficult to describe in plain terms, because the series treats them as something close to a different layer of reality. They form an invisible network that links every single descendant of Ymir, every person who carries her blood, across any distance and even across death itself. Through the Paths, the dead and the living of her bloodline remain connected, threads of consciousness all reaching back toward one central point. It was in that central place that Ymir remained, and what she did there is almost unbearable to consider. For roughly 2,000 years, she stood at the heart of the Paths, alone, and she built. Every time a subject of Ymir transformed into a Titan, the flesh and the bone for that giant body had to come from somewhere, and it came from her, shaped and sent out through the Paths in a process the story likens to something almost magical. The endless supply of monstrous bodies that terrorized the walls, the muscle and the towering frames of every Titan that ever walked, all of it flowed from the labor of one girl who had died long before any of the people she menaced were born. She built the giants. She had been building them without rest for 20 centuries. The question of why she kept doing it is one the series answers only carefully, and it is worth being honest about how much it leaves open. On the surface, the explanation is obedience. Even after death, Ymir continued to obey the will of the royal bloodline, the line of King Fritz, as though the chains placed on her in life had simply followed her into the Paths. The deeper reason the story eventually offers is harder and more human. It suggests that Ymir was bound not only by fear but by something twisted into the shape of love, a hopeless devotion to the very king who had owned and used her. That answer arrives fully only at the end of the series, and even then the story presents it as something to feel rather than something to fully understand. The exact contents of a 2,000-year-old mind are not the kind of thing that can be laid out cleanly, and the series respects that by leaving a shadow over her reasons. The creature that started it all did not vanish. The source of all living matter remained tied to the power it had created, bound in particular to the central Titan that traced straight back to Ymir herself. It would stay hidden and dormant for 2,000 years, waiting until one specific person finally reached the heart of the Paths and disturbed it again. When that day came, far in the future of the story, the creature would prove it had never truly been passive. Until then, it lay still, a quiet engine humming beneath everything. So the origin of the entire conflict is not a war or a weapon or a clever villain. It is a child who was treated as property, granted a power she never had, used until the day she died, and then trapped for 2,000 years in service to the people who broke her. Everything that follows in the story, the walls, the giants, the bloodlines, the wars, the desperate plans of desperate people, all of it rests on the bent shoulders of that one girl standing alone in a place outside of time, shaping bodies for descendants who would never know her name. The mystery of where the Titans came from has an answer, and the answer is sadder than any monster could ever be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single hunted girl became the source of every giant that ever walked, and her death scattered her power into the hands of her own children. From that first terrible meal grew a whole inheritance, a chain of devouring that turned one power into 9, each one carrying a quiet countdown toward death. Section 3. The 9 Titans and the Curse of 13 Years. When Ymir's 3 daughters ate their mother's body, they did something none of them could have understood at the time. They did not simply preserve a power. They started a clock, and that clock would keep ticking inside every person who ever held a piece of that power for the next 2,000 years. The division of Ymir's strength among her children was the first turn of a wheel that never stopped, and the rules that governed that wheel were strange, rigid, and quietly cruel. To understand almost everything that happens later, those rules have to be understood first, because nearly every desperate choice the characters make is shaped by them. In the beginning, there was only the single power that had lived inside Ymir. After her death, split three ways, and passed down through her daughter's bloodlines, it slowly fractured further. Generation after generation, the power branched and settled until it had taken 9 separate forms. These came to be known as the 9 Titans, and each one was its own distinct inheritance, with its own shape, its own abilities, and its own grim history of being passed from body to body. The greatest of the 9 was the Founding Titan, the one that traced straight back to Ymir herself and held authority over all the others. Beside it stood the Attack Titan, a giant tied in a strange way to the idea of freedom, with secrets of its own that later sections will unfold. There was the Colossal Titan, vast enough to tower over a wall and capable of releasing devastating heat and steam. There was the Armored Titan, plated in hardened skin like a living fortress, and the Female Titan, agile and able to call ordinary titans toward it. The Beast Titan stood tall and animal-like, able to hurl objects with terrifying precision. The Jaw Titan was small and fast, with crushing strength in its bite. The Cart Titan was a sturdy 4-legged form built for endurance, and the Warhammer Titan could shape hardened weapons out of its own body from a distance. 9 powers in all, scattered across the world, each one a piece of the same dead girl. The way these powers moved from one person to the next is one of the most disturbing mechanics in the entire story. And it began with that first meal. To pass a Titan power on, the current holder had to be a person who carried one of the 9 could not simply hand the gift to another. The successor had to consume them, taking the power into their own body through the act of devouring. In the earliest days, this was done much the way Ymir's daughters had done it, through the raw and brutal eating of a body. Over the centuries, the method was refined into something colder and more controlled, though no less unsettling. The refined method worked through the spinal fluid of the Titan. A liquid drawn from a Titan could be turned into a serum and injected into an ordinary subject of Ymir. That injection would transform the person into a mindless giant, and then that mindless giant would be made to devour the holder of one of the 9 powers. Through that devouring, the intelligent power would transfer, and the formerly mindless creature would shrink back into a human being, now carrying the inheritance. It was a process built around death by design. For one person to receive the power, another almost always had to die inside the mouth of a... Entire generations of holders lived knowing exactly how their power had come to them and exactly how it would one day leave. Sitting on top of all of this was the rule that shaped the whole tragedy. Every person who received one of the 9 Titans was given only 13 years to live from the moment they first gained the power. No matter their age, no matter their health, no matter how strong or how careful they were, 13 years after inheritance, their body would fail and they would die. The story explains this through the figure of Ymir herself. She had held the power for 13 years before she died, and because she was the founder, the very source of everything, no one who came after her could ever surpass her. Her descendants were locked to the same span she had been given. This fixed and unbreakable shortening of life became known as the Curse of Ymir. The curse made no exceptions for cleverness or for greed. A person could gather more than one of the 9 powers into a single body, and some did, but holding several Titans never bought a single extra day. The 13 years counted from the first inheritance and from nothing else. The proof was Ymir herself, who had carried the strength of all 9 in one body at the very beginning and still died on schedule. Much later in the story, when a young man came to hold several of the powers at once, the people around him quietly feared what the curse meant for him, and the question of whether the rule truly applied to him hung over the narrative for a long time. The broad law, though, was clear. Power could be stacked, life could not be extended. The bill always came due at 13 years. There was a further rule, almost a failsafe, and it ensured that the powers could never simply be wiped out by killing their holder. If a person carrying one of the 9 Titans died without passing the power on, that power did not die with it. It could not be destroyed at all. Instead, it would travel through the unseen network of the paths and be reborn in a random newborn child somewhere among the subjects of Ymir, regardless of where that child was or who their parents were. A baby chosen by nothing but chance would suddenly carry an ancient inheritance and, with it, the 13-year countdown, often without anyone around them ever knowing. The power was eternal. Only the people who held it were temporary. This is why the governments and families who controlled the Titans were so obsessed with arranging successors. A power left to scatter on its own was a power that could land anywhere and be lost to enemies, or wasted on someone who had no idea what they carried. It is worth separating the two very different kinds of Titans the story shows, because the difference matters constantly. Most of the giants that roamed outside the walls were what the records call pure Titans. These were mindless. They had lost their humanity entirely, driven by an empty instinct to seek out and consume people, with no thought and no self left inside them. A pure Titan would live on indefinitely as long as no one killed it, wandering without purpose. The 9 Titans were something. Their holders kept their human minds, their memories, and their will even while transformed. They could choose their actions, speak, and fight with intelligence, and their giant forms were far stronger and stranger than any ordinary Titan. The same blood ran through both kinds, but only the 9 carried a thinking person inside. There was one bridge between those two sea states, and it offered a sliver of mercy in an otherwise merciless system. If a pure Titan, one of the mindless ones, managed to devour a holder of one of the 9 Titans, that mindless creature would absorb the intelligent power and return to being human. A person lost to the empty hunger of a pure Titan could, in theory, be restored to humanity by consuming a shifter. It was a brutal kind of cure, paid for with another person's life, but it meant that the line between monster and human was not always final. This single mechanic becomes deeply important to several characters later in the story, and it is one of the few threads of hope woven into the design. The paths did more than carry power and bodies across distance. They also carried memory, because every holder of the 9 was connected through that unseen network to all the holders who came before. A person who inherited one of the powers gained access to the memories of their predecessor. Fragments of other lives, other deaths, other moments lived centuries earlier could surface inside the mind of a new holder. This inheritance of memory explains a great deal about how knowledge and trauma pass down through the story, and one of the 9 powers in particular has a relationship with memory and time so unusual that it gets its own section much later. For now, it is enough to say that a Titan inheritor was never entirely alone in his own head. The dead were always there, faint but present, reaching forward through the paths. All of this gave the giants their familiar and terrible traits. Their bodies ran hot enough to give off steam, and they could heal from wounds at incredible speed, regrowing limbs and closing terrible injuries in moments. Their size let them shatter buildings and walls without effort. And yet for all that strength, every Titan shared a single fatal weakness. At the back of the neck and the nape lay a small, vulnerable point. A deep enough cut there would kill the creature, and the entire enormous body would then begin to crumble and steam away into nothing. For an intelligent Titan, the human holder sat exactly within that nape, joined to the giant body, which is why skilled soldiers learned to strike that one place above all others. The whole art of fighting Titans came down to reaching that small spot on a creature many times one's own height. The cost of carrying a Titan power went beyond the 13-year limit. The notes left behind by the doctor who crossed the sea suggested that taking these powers into a human body placed a heavy strain on it, wearing the holder down over their shortened years. There were small inconsistencies that fans and characters alike note, moments where one holder seemed less worn than the rule would predict, and the story does not tie every loose thread there to a perfect knot. The series leaves a faint uncertainty around the exact biology of the strain, and it is fair to say that not every fine detail of how the curse acts on the body is spelled out beyond doubt. What is certain is the outcome. To hold one of the 9 Titans was to be handed enormous power and, in the same breath, a death sentence with a known date. Underneath every fact in this section runs one quiet question that the characters could not stop asking. Could the curse ever be broken? Could the cycle of devouring of 13-year lives of children born already condemned ever be brought to an end? For most of the story, the answer appeared to be no. The rule had held for 2,000 years without a single exception. The power could not be destroyed, the holders could not outlive their span, and the wheel kept turning. Whether that wheel could be stopped, and what it would cost to stop it, is a thread the series carries all the way to its final moments, and the answer waits in the last section of this story. For now, the machine simply runs as it always has, grinding through holder after holder, each one inheriting a piece of a dead girl and a clock they can never reset. So the 9 powers were never really 9 separate gifts. They were 9 fragments of one person, scattered across the world, each carrying a piece of her strength and the same shortened life she had suffered. The empire that grew from them, the wars fought over them, the families that hoarded them, all of it rested on a system of eating, dying, and being reborn that no one inside it had ever managed to escape. The Titans were a power and a prison at the same time, and the people who held them were as trapped as the girl who first fell beneath the tree. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One power had become 9, each passed on through devouring and each shadowed by the same 13-year death. Yet among those 9, one stood above all the rest, a Titan that could command the others and reshape the very minds of an entire people, guarded for 100 years by a secret no one was meant to question. Section 4. The Founding Titan, Royal Blood, and the Vow That Stopped a King. Among the 9 fragments of Ymir's power, 8 were terrible weapons. One was something closer to a throne. The Founding Titan was the piece of her strength that reached back to the very beginning, the one tied directly to the source of all living matter and to the central point of the paths, and it carried abilities the other 8 could only dream of. To hold it was, in theory, to hold the leash of the entire world. Yet for 100 years, the people who possessed it did almost nothing with it. And the reason why is one of the quietest and strangest puzzles in the whole story. A family sat on a power that could end any war in an afternoon, and they chose to hide behind walls and tremble. Understanding that choice means understanding three things, and they fit together like the gears of a lock. The first thing to understand is what the founding titan could actually do, because its power went far beyond brute force. Two abilities set it apart from every other titan. The first was command. The holder of the founding titan could control other titans, both the mindless wandering kind and, under the right conditions, the intelligent shifters as well. A single will could move armies of giants, turn them, stop them, or send them marching in any direction. The second ability was even more unstable. The founding titan could reach into the minds of the subjects of fear. Every person descended from that ancient bloodline and reshape what they remember. It could erase memories, plant false ones, and rewrite the understanding of an entire people without any of them ever knowing it had happened. Power over bodies and power over minds held in the same pair of hands. The story has a name for the deepest layer of this ability. It is called the coordinate. The coordinate is the central point through which all the threads of the paths connect, the hub at the very heart of that unseen network linking every descendant of Ymir. Whoever could truly reach the coordinate stood at the center of everything, able to touch every subject of Ymir at once. This is why the founding titan was the most coveted power in the world, the prize that nations crossed oceans to capture. It was not simply strong. It was the closest thing the story had to a master key. The second thing to understand is the catch, and it is a strange and specific one. The full power of the founding titan could only be unlocked by someone carrying royal blood, the bloodline that traced back through King Fritz to Ymir's own children. A holder who lacked that blood could not access the deepest abilities on their own. There was one narrow workaround the story establishes carefully. If a non-royal holder of the founding titan came into direct physical contact with a person who did carry royal blood, the power could awaken through that contact. The blood was the ignition. Without it, even a person who carried the founding titan inside their body was holding a locked weapon, able to feel its weight but unable to fire it. This single rule about blood quietly shapes a great deal of the plot, because it means that the most powerful force in the world depended entirely on a particular family, and that family had its own dark history. That history is the third and final thing, and it answers the central question of why a godlike power sat idle for a century. To reach it, the story travels back to a great catastrophe known as the Great Titan War, fought long before the walls existed, when the Eldian Empire that had ruled through fear finally turned on itself and tore itself apart. By the time the dust settled, the power had shifted, the empire was broken, and the holder of the founding titan was a man the records name as Karl Fritz, counted as the 145th king of his line. Faced with the ruin of his people and the weight of everything they had done, this king made a decision that would define the next 100 years. Karl Fritz looked at the long, blood-soaked history of his empire and decided that his people had earned their suffering. Through the founding titan, he could see the memories of every king who came before him, the whole accumulated record of conquest and cruelty carried out in Ymir's name, and what he took from it was not pride but shame. He came to believe that the Eldians had brought far more harm into the world than good, and that the only just future was one of quiet punishment. Rather than rebuild the empire or strike back at the enemies who had broken it, he gathered a portion of his subjects and withdrew them to a single island at the edge of the world, the island of Paradis. There he used the founding titan to raise enormous walls and to hide his people inside them, sealed away from a world that hated them. He did more than hide, though. To keep his island safe without ever lifting a hand in war, he buried a terrible threat inside those very walls, and let the rest of the world know it existed in vague and frightening terms. A promise that if Paradis were ever truly threatened, an unstoppable force would be released to flatten everything beyond the sea. The exact nature of that buried threat is the subject of the next section, so it can wait. What matters here is the strategy. The king did not defend his people with armies. He defended them with fear, with the doomsday hidden in the stone, while he himself renounced violence entirely. Then he did the strangest thing of all, and it is the heart of this section. To make sure his descendants could never undo his choice, Karl Fritz bound the royal bloodline itself to his new philosophy. He embraced what the story calls the vow-renouncing war, and he wove it into the very power of the founding titan. From that point on, any holder of the founding titan who also carried royal blood would be overwhelmed by Karl Fritz's will the moment they connected fully to the power. His ideology, his shame, his determination to do nothing would flow into them and override their own desires. A royal-blooded holder simply could not bring themselves to use the founding titan for war or conquest, no matter how badly they or their people needed it. The will of the king reached forward through time and tied the hands of everyone who came after him. This is the answer to the puzzle. For 100 years, the founding titan rested in the hands of a royal family hidden on Paradis, and during all that time, it could not be used to protect them, to free them, or to strike at the world that wanted them dead. Every royal holder who touched its full power found their own will replaced by the dead king's pacifism. They became, in a sense, prisoners of an ancestor. The most powerful weapon ever created was held by people who were spiritually incapable of pulling the trigger. A child of that bloodline could inherit the power, feel the entire might of the paths flowing through them, and still be utterly unable to act, compelled instead toward the same quiet acceptance of suffering that Karl Fritz had chosen. The walls did not only keep the world out, they kept a paralyzed god locked in Nestide, generation after generation. The cruelty of this arrangement is worth sitting with. The royal family on Paradis carried the means to end their people's fear, and they could not use it. They watched the Titans roam outside, watched their subjects live and die in ignorance, and held within themselves the power to change all of it, while the dead king's will held them frozen. Some of them came to accept this as a kind of righteousness, believing as Karl Fritz had, that the Eldians deserved no better. Others may have struggled against it in private, though the story keeps much of their inner lives in shadow. Either way, the result was the same. The founding Titan slept inside people who could not wake. This creates the central paradox that the rest of the story spends a great deal of energy trying to break. The founding Titan needed royal blood to function yet royal blood also enslaved the holder to the vow renouncing. The very thing that unlocked the power also guaranteed it would never be used freely. Anyone who could turn the key was, by the act of being able to turn it, forbidden from doing so. For 100 years this lock held perfectly, and the world stayed in its frozen balance, with Paradis hidden and the powers across the sea unable to claim the prize they hungered for. The way out of this trap when it finally came was as elegant as it was monstrous, and the story builds toward it carefully across many chapters. The solution lay in separating the two requirements. What if the founding Titan were held not by a royal at all, but by an ordinary person with no royal blood in their veins? Such a person could never bind themselves to Karl Fritz's will, because the vow only gripped those of royal descent. They would be free. And if that free, non-royal holder could then come into contact with someone who did carry royal blood, the power would unlock through that contact while the holder's own will remain entirely their own, a free hand on the master. This is precisely the loophole that one young man eventually exploits. A person who inherited the founding Titan from his father yet carried no royal blood through his mother, and who would later reach for a royal relative to light the fuse. The full shape of that plan and the staggering price it carried belongs to the final sections of this story. The mechanism that made it possible is rooted entirely here, in the gap between a power that demanded royal blood and a vow that punished it. There is one more glimpse worth noting, because it foreshadows everything. Long before any of this was understood, that same young man once touched the giant body of a particular mindless Titan during a desperate moment, a creature that happened to carry royal blood, and for an instant the impossible happened. Without meaning to, he commanded a horde of ordinary Titans to obey him, sending them to attack on his behalf. It made no sense to anyone at the time, including him. Only much later did the pieces fit. He had brushed against royal blood while carrying the founding Titan inside him, and for a heartbeat, the locked weapon had stirred. That single inexplicable moment was the whole secret of the series flickering into view years before anyone could read it. So the answer to why a king with the power of a god chose to do nothing is not cowardice and not simple kindness. It is a man so broken by his people's history that he decided their punishment was just, and so determined that he chained his own bloodline to that decision forever. The founding Titan became a throne that no one who sat on it could rule from. It took someone outside the bloodline entirely, someone untouched by the dead king's will, to finally break 100 years of paralysis. Until that person arrived, the greatest power in the world stayed exactly where Karl Fritz had left it, sleeping inside the walls, guarded by a vow that turned its keepers into its captive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A king with the power to rule the world chose instead to hide it, binding his own bloodline to silence and burying his people's safety inside the stone. Yet that buried safety was not made of brick or mortar. It was alive, sleeping in its millions within the walls, waiting for a single command to wake. Section 5. The Titans sleeping inside the walls, for the people living inside them. The walls were everything. They were the floor and the ceiling of the world, the line between life and the hungry country beyond. The single fact that made it possible to sleep at night. Over 100 years, that dependence curdled into something close to worship. A quiet religion grew up around the three great rings of stone, an order of believers who treated the walls not merely as protection but as something holy, raised by a divine hand to shelter the chosen. To this order, the walls were sacred objects, and to damage them, to drill into them or alter them in any way, was the deepest kind of blasphemy. The priests of this faith guarded the stone with a devotion that struck most ordinary people as strange, even fanatical. No one outside the order understood why a wall should be defended like a god. The three rings each carried a name, and those names reached back further than almost anyone inside. The outermost was Wall Maria, the middle ring was Wall Rose, and the innermost was Wall Sina. Long before, in a story buried 2,000 years deep, those had been the names of three little girls, the daughters of the first king, the children who ate their dying mother and carried her power forward. The walls that defined the entire world were named after the children at the very root of the curse, though the connection had been wiped from memory along with so much else. People prayed beneath those names without ever knowing whose they were. The first crack in the mystery of the walls came almost by accident, in a moment that should have been ordinary. During one of the many disasters that struck the inner districts, a section of wall was damaged, and a wandering titan ended up lodged against the stone, sealed there when the breach was closed. The creature could not be removed without harming the wall itself, and so it sat embedded in the ring, a strange and ugly fixture. Then, in the course of dealing with it, part of the outer covering of the wall was knocked loose, and sunlight fell on what lay beneath the surface of the stone. What the light revealed was a face. Not carved, not painted, but a real face. The steaming flesh of an enormous titan pressed into the very substance of the wall, packed so tightly with others like it that the whole structure was made of them. As the sun warmed the exposed flesh, it began to give off heat and vapor, the same way a living titan does. The priest of the wall religion who witnessed this came apart with terror. He pleaded for the exposed flesh to be covered again before the sun could fully wake it, because he understood exactly what would happen if these things ever stirred. The wall was not a wall in the way anyone had believed. The stone was a skin stretched over a sleeping multitude. This is the secret the Order of the Walls had been protecting all along, and it is the reason their faith forbade so much as a nail driven into the sacred rings. The three great walls of Paradise were not built from rock or mortar. They were built from titans, an almost unimaginable number of them, colossal class giants standing shoulder to shoulder in a vast unbroken ring, their bodies hardened and fused together to form the smooth gray surface the people lived behind. Each wall was a single endless wall of bodies, millions of them, sealed in hardened skin and standing in silent rows, holding perfectly still for 100 years. The civilization inside had grown its fields, raised its children, and buried its dead in the shadow of a sleeping army, never knowing that the protection towering over them had faces. The maker of this monstrous structure was the same king who had renounced war and chained his bloodline to silence. Karl Fritz, the 145th king, had used the power of the founding titan to create this hidden host when he withdrew his people to the island. Through the founding titan's command over the titans and its reach into the paths, he raised an uncountable mass of colossal titans and arranged them into the three rings, then had them harden their skin so that they would stand as solid walls. The people who followed him to Paradis lived their lives inside a fortress made of the very thing they feared most, and the king made certain that no one would ever learn the truth. With the same power that built the walls, he reached into the minds of his subjects and erased the knowledge of what the walls were made of, what lay beyond the sea, and almost everything else about who they had been. A population was sealed inside a living structure and then made to forget that anything lay outside it at all. The reason the king did this is the part that turns a horror into a strategy. The hidden host inside the walls was not meant only to defend, it was meant to threaten. Karl Fritz let the wider world understand, in vague and frightening terms, that the island held a power capable of destroying everything beyond it. If Paradis were ever truly attacked, the holder of the founding titan could wake the titans in the walls and send them out. Freed from the stone, that endless tide of colossal giants would march across the land in every direction, their enormous bodies trampling everything in their path, leveling cities, crushing armies, and flattening the world flat beneath their feet. This catastrophe had a name that hung over the entire series like a held breath. It was called the Rumbling, and the mere possibility of it was enough to keep the rest of the world from ever setting foot on Paradis. A threat that terrible did not need to be carried out. It only needed to be believed. For 100 years it worked. The nations across the sea, however much they hated the Eldians of Paradis and hungered for the founding titan hidden there, did not dare to launch a full invasion, because no one wished to be the one who pushed the island into releasing its. The deterrent held the whole world in a fragile balance. Paradis stayed hidden and quiet, the titans in the walls stayed asleep, and the threat of the rumbling sat between the island and its enemies like a loaded weapon no one wanted to test. The walls protected the people inside not only by standing in the way of titans, but by holding the entire planet hostage. There is a deep irony buried in all of it, and it ties directly back to the secret of the founding titan. The threat of the rumbling was real in the sense that the titans were truly there and truly capable of destroying the world. Yet the people who held the power to release them could never actually do it. The only ones who could fully command the founding titan were those of royal blood, and the royal bloodline was bound, every single one of them, by Karl Fritz's vow-renouncing war. A royal holder could no more order the rumbling than they could fly. The will of the dead king would seize them the instant they reached for that power and turn their aggression to dust. So the greatest threat in the world was in truth a threat its keepers were spiritually unable to carry out. The loaded weapon had a safety lock built into the very blood of everyone who could fire it. The world feared the rumbling for a century, never knowing that the family guarding it had been rendered incapable of unleashing it. The walls, then, were a perfect prison disguised as a perfect shelter. They kept the people inside safe, and they kept those same people ignorant, and they stood as a doomsday device that could not be triggered by anyone willing and able to use it. The whole arrangement depended on a balance of secret. The world had to believe the island would use the rumbling. The island had to forget the rumbling existed at all. And the royal family had to remain trapped between the power to save their people and a vow that forbade them from doing so. As long as all three of those conditions held, the Grey Rings would keep standing, silent and sacred, with their millions of sleeping faces turned inward toward the people who prayed to them. The Order of the Walls had carried fragments of this truth in secret for generations, which is why they guarded the stone so jealously, and why their priests would rather die than allow the rings to be studied or breached. They knew, or half knew, that something terrible slept inside the structure they worshipped, and that to disturb it carelessly might wake the very catastrophe the walls were built to threaten. Their fanaticism, which seemed so senseless to outsiders, was the panic of people standing guard over a secret too large to share and too dangerous to ignore. All of this sets up the question the rest of the story eventually answers. The Titans in the walls could only be released by the full power of the founding Titan, and that power could only be unlocked through royal blood, and royal blood could not bring itself to give the order. So how could a host of millions of giants, sealed in stone and guarded by a vow 2,000 years in the making, ever be set loose? The answer is the same loophole that ran beneath the previous section. A holder of the founding Titan who carried no royal blood would not be bound by Karl Fritz's will. Such a person, free of the vow, yet able to borrow the royal connection through contact, could reach the sleeping host and do what no king had been willing to do in 100 years. They could give the command. They could wake the walls. When that moment finally arrived, far ahead in the story, the Grey Rings would crack open along their entire length, and the faces that had slept for a century would lift their heads, step out of the stone, and begin to walk. The shelter would become the apocalypse it had always secretly been. The whole long piece of paradise, built on a threat no one could carry out, would end the instant someone outside the bloodline reached for the leash. Till then, the walls simply stood, holy and silent, while the people inside slept soundly above an army that had been waiting patiently for a single command. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The walls that sheltered an entire people were built from a sleeping army, raised as both a shield and a doomsday no king could ever bring himself to unleash. Yet long before any of that came to light, the peace had already been broken from within, by enemies who had crossed the sea, taken human faces, and lived quietly among the very people they came to destroy. Section 6. The enemies who lived among them. The disaster that began the entire story was never random. On the day the Southern District fell, two titans appeared that did not behave like any of the mindless creatures the people had learned to fear. The first was enormous beyond reason, taller than the wall itself, and it struck once at the gate with terrible precision before vanishing in a burst of steam. The second was covered in hardened plating like a living battering ram, and it charged the inner gate and broke it open so that the wandering titans could pour through. These two acted with purpose. They arrived, they did exactly what they came to do, and they left. For a long time, no one inside the walls could explain it. Why would titans of all things plan an attack? The answer, when it finally came, was one of the cruelest revelations in the series, because it meant the monsters had names, and those names belonged to people the heroes would come to love. Before that truth surfaced, life inside the walls settled into something almost ordinary. The survivors of the fallen district grew up, and many of them joined the military. Among the young recruits training together were the children who would become the core of the story, the boy who had lost his mother, his adopted sister, his thoughtful friend, and a wider circle of trainees who ate together, slept in the same barracks, complained about the same BU drills, and slowly became something like a family. Within that circle were a few faces that seemed perfectly normal. A large, dependable young man who carried himself like an older brother and whom the others instinctively trusted. A tall, anxious boy who stayed close to him and rarely spoke up. A small, quiet girl with a sharp mind and an even sharper skill in hand-to-hand combat. They trained beside everyone else for years. They bled and laughed and grew alongside the people they had secretly come to destroy. The first thread of the truth surfaced during one of the Survey Corps expeditions beyond the walls. A new kind of Titan appeared in the open country, one that moved with intelligence and clear intent, a lean and powerful female Titan that ignored ordinary prey and instead hunted with single-minded focus for one specific person, the boy who carries a secret power inside him. This Titan fought like a trained soldier. It used technique, it made decisions, and it tore through some of the most skilled fighters humanity had, all in pursuit of a goal it understood. An intelligent enemy wearing a Titan's body, working from inside the walls, was something no one had prepared for. After a desperate and costly effort, the soldiers managed to corner this creature, and the person inside it was finally exposed. The female Titan was the quiet, sharp girl from the training corps. Her name was Anne, and she had been one of them the whole time. When she was cornered, she sealed herself away inside a hardened crystal, locking her secrets behind a shell that no one could break. The discovery of one traitor was shattering on its own. The next blow was far worse, and the story delivers it with a calm so casual that it lands like a physical wound. During a moment of rest after a brutal battle, The large, dependable young man who had been an older brother to everyone simply said it out loud, almost gently, as though confessing something he had carried too long. He admitted that he was the armored titan, the plated giant that had broken the inner gate, and that his anxious companion was the colossal titan, the towering creature that had appeared above the wall on the day everything fell. The two boys who had trained and lived among the heroes for years were the very monsters who had murdered their families and destroyed their home. There was no dramatic unmasking, no villainous speech. There was just a tired young man stating a fact, and the world of the people listening to him caving in. These were not the only secrets that came out. The truth of who these people were reached back across the sea to the nation of Marley and to a program that turned children into weapons. The Eldians living under Marleyan rule, penned into their sealed districts, were offered one narrow path toward dignity. Their children could be chosen as warriors, trained from a young age, and granted one of the Titan powers Marley controlled. And if they served their masters well, their families might be raised in status and treated with something closer to respect. To desperate children living as outcasts, this was an almost irresistible dream, and so they competed fiercely for the chance to become living weapons in service of the people who despised them. A small unit of these warrior children had been sent across the sea to Paradis years before the start of the main story, and they carried a mission. Marley wanted the founding Titan, the master power hidden somewhere on the island with the royal family, and these children were sent to find it and bring it home. The unit had 4 members. The large young man who would confess so quietly held the armored Titan. His anxious companion held the colossal Titan. The sharp girl held the female Titan. And there was a 4th, a boy who held the Jaw Titan and who served as a kind of heart for the group. To carry out their mission, this unit triggered the fall of the Southern District, breaking the outer and inner gates to throw the island into chaos and to begin their search for the power they had been sent to claim. The children who broke the walls were themselves children, sent by adults who had raised them to hate their own blood. The 4th member never made it far. Soon after the unit arrived on the island, that boy was caught and devoured by a wandering Titan, dying almost as soon as the mission began. The creature that ate him absorbed his Jaw Titan power and, through that act, regained a human form, becoming a person who would later play her own quiet role in the story, a freckled young woman who happened to share the name Amir with the ancient founder of everything. Though the two had no blood connection, her own history was its own small tragedy, having spent decades trapped as a mindless wandering Titan before that moment restored her. The loss of the 4th warrior left the remaining 3 to carry the mission alone, and it bent them in different ways. With their friend gone and their goal still far out of reach, the survivors had no choice but to bury themselves deeper inside the enemy and wait. The years of pretending took a heavy toll, especially on the young man who held the armored Titan. To survive the impossible position he was in, sharing meals and laughter with the very people he had been sent to deceive and destroy, his mind seems to have split itself in 2. At times, he genuinely thought of himself as an ordinary soldier of the walls, fully believing in the cause of the people he lived among, his role as a warrior buried so deep that even he lost track of it. At other times, the truth surfaced and he remembered exactly what he was. The story presents this fracture as a kind of survival, a mind protecting itself from a guilt it could not otherwise carry. By the time he confessed, the weight of holding both selves at once had nearly broken him, which is part of why the confession came out so flat and exhausted. He was not gloating. He was a young man who had been pretending for so long that he could no longer remember how to stop. The reasons these warriors did what they did are where the simple idea of villains falls apart. They were not monsters who chose cruelty for its own sake. They were children raised inside a system that told them their entire people were a race of devils, that the only way to earn the right to exist with dignity was to serve, and that the mission across the sea was a path to honor for themselves and safety for the families they had left behind. They had been handed terrible powers and pointed at an island full of people they had been taught to see as enemies, and they had believed it because they were young, and because believing it was the only way their world made sense. The girl who became the female Titan acted in part out of a promise tied to her own father, a vow to come home that drove her through everything she did. Each of them carried private burdens that the indoctrination had wrapped around like armor. They were victims wearing the shapes of attackers. This is the deepest blow the section delivers, and it changes the texture of the whole series. The enemy who destroyed the hero's world was not a faceless horde. It was a handful of frightened children who had grown up under a different flag, sent by adults who had stolen their childhoods, and who then spent years living shoulder to shoulder with the people they had wronged, sharing real friendships that were no less real for being built on a lie. The boy who lost his mother trained beside the boy whose Titan had set the disaster in motion. The bonds were genuine. The betrayal was genuine. Both things were true at the same time, and the story refuses to let either one cancel the other. By the time these revelations had all surfaced, the simple picture the series began with was gone for good. There were no pure heroes facing pure monsters. There were only people on every side, each shaped by where they happened to be born, each one carrying out terrible acts in the name of survival or duty, or a love for someone far away. The Titans that broke the walls had human faces, and those faces belonged to Fren. The war that had seemed to be humanity against the giants turned out to be people against people, and many of the deadliest enemies had spent years sleeping in the same barracks as the heroes, eating the same meals, dreading the same future. The mystery of who broke the walls had a clear answer at last, and the answers made everything sadder rather than simpler. Among those who lived inside the walls, though, were two people whose strength could not be explained by any Titan power at all. A man and a girl who fought the giants and won without ever transforming. Their gift came from somewhere older and stranger, a bloodline engineered long ago for a single purpose. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The monsters who shattered the walls turned out to be frightened children and across the sea, friends and enemies wearing the same faces. Yet not everyone inside those walls drew their strength from a stolen Titan, and two warriors in particular carried a power that no serum had ever given them. Section 7. The bloodline that was built to kill Titans. In a world where the only way to stand against a Titan was to become one, two people broke the rule entirely. They never transformed. They never carried a serum or inherited one of the 9 powers. And yet a man and a girl, both ordinary in body, could move faster, strike harder, and kill more efficiently than anyone around them, cutting down giants many times their size, with nothing but blades and impossible reflex. One of them was widely regarded as the single strongest soldier humanity had. The other rose to the very top of her training class and fought as though she had been born with a sword in her hand. For a long time, their strength was simply accepted as natural talent, the kind of gift that turns up rarely in any generation. The truth was far stranger, and it reached back to the same old empire that had built everything else in this story. Their strength did not arrive gradually, the way a skill is usually earned. It arrived all at once in a single terrible moment, and both of them remembered exactly. For the girl, that moment came when she was 9 years old. Criminals broke into her home, killed her parents, and dragged her away, intending to sell her because of a rare heritage that made her valuable to the wrong sort of people. A boy her own age came to free her, and in the middle of that nightmare, with death close on every side, he told her one simple thing. He told her to fight. Something inside her woke. A child who had been a helpless victim a moment before suddenly killed a grown attacker with a single strike, crushing and breaking with a strength no 9-year-old should possess. From that day forward, she was different, stronger and sharper in a way she could not explain. The man had lived through a similar moment in his own brutal youth. Cornered and beaten nearly to death by people who meant to use him, his latent powers surged up in the same way, and he turned on his attackers with a ferocity that left him standing alone among the fallen. When the two of them compared their pasts much later, the pattern was unmistakable. Each had been pushed to the edge of death while bound to protect someone or to obey a command in a desperate instant, and in that instant a hidden strength had unlocked inside them. The man even noted that his own uncle, a notorious and feared killer, had once described an awakening of exactly the same kind. The same key fit all 3 locks. The reason for this was that the two of them were family, however distantly. They both belonged to a clan called the Ackerman, a bloodline that had long ago been something more than human. The shape of their gift and where it came from was finally laid out by the boy who had once told the girl to fight, now grown and carrying terrible knowledge of his own. According to what he revealed, the Ackerman clan had not arisen by accident. They were a product of the ancient Eldian Empire, created through a blend of the Empire's experiments with the subjects of Ymir and the science of the Titans. The goal had been to forge a line of warriors who could wield the strength of the Titans while remaining fully human, a living sword that could protect the king. The Ackermans were that sword. Their bodies could tap into the power of the Titans without ever transforming, channeling the strength and the combat instinct of their ancestors directly into a human frame. This explained the awakening. An Ackerman lived an ordinary life, no stronger than anyone else, until a particular set of conditions came together. The clan was built to protect, and so each Ackerman would, in effect, attach themselves to someone who served as a kind of host, a person they were driven to defend. When that host was in grave danger and the Ackerman themselves faced death, the engineered instinct buried in their blood would surge to the surface, flooding their body with the borrowed power of the Titans and turning them, in an instant, into something far beyond a normal human. The girl had awakened defending the boy who saved her. The man had awakened in his own moment of mortal danger. The trigger was always the same combination of a host to protect and death pressing close. Once unlocked, the strength never left. There was a second gift hidden in the Ackerman blood, and it turned out to be even more important than their strength. They were immune to the power of the founding Titan to rewrite minds. When the old king had reached into the memories of his people and erased the truth of the world, the Ackermans could not be touched. The memory of who they were, of the history of the walls, of the world outside, could not be wiped from them the way it was wiped from everyone else. This immunity is part of why the clan could not be controlled, and it carried a heavy cost. Because the king could not force them to forget, he could not force them to accept his ideology either. An Ackerman could look at the king's vision and simply refuse it, and that refusal made them dangerous to a ruler who depended on a population that could be reshaped at will. That danger is what destroyed the clan. The Ackermans had once stood beside the throne as its protectors, but when the king embraced his philosophy of withdrawal and silence, the clan would not bend to it. Because they could not be made to forget and could not be made to obey, they were turned upon and hunted nearly to extinction. A line of warriors built to guard the king was branded a threat, and all but wiped out, scattered and persecuted across generations until only a handful remained. By the time of the main story, only 2 known members of the clan were still alive: the man and the girl, the last surviving edge of a sword that had once defended kings. The man's uncle, the feared killer who had also awakened the Ackerman power, had spent part of his own strange life serving as a bodyguard to the true hidden king, a final echo of the clan's original purpose before he too passed from the story. The girl's particular heritage added another layer to her tragedy. Her mother had come from a rare lineage, a people of a distant origin, nearly vanished within the walls, and that rarity had made her family a target for those who would sell such bloodlines for profit. It was this, rather than anything to do with the Ackerman power, that brought the criminals to her childhood home. Her father had carried Ackerman blood, but had never awakened, living and dying as an ordinary man, which is why he could not save his family. The girl inherited both lines, the hunted rarity of her mother and the dormant warrior strength of her father, and it was the violence aimed at the first that finally triggered the second. There is a darker and more uncertain thread woven through all of this, and the story leaves it deliberately tangled. An awakened Ackerman, according to what the boy revealed, would sometimes suffer sudden, sharp headaches. He explained these as the result of the Ackerman's true self resisting the engineered instinct to protect the host, a kind of inner war between the person they actually were and the role their blood demanded of them. The girl had suffered exactly these headaches for years. Then the boy went further, and what he said cut deeper than any blade. He claimed that her devotion to him, the fierce loyalty and love she had carried since the day he saved her, was not truly her own feeling at all, but merely the Ackerman instinct, the blood compelling her to cling to and protect her host. He said this coldly, and he used it to push her away. Whether that claim was true is something the story refuses to settle, and it is fair to say plainly that it never fully resolves. Not long after, the thoughtful friend who knew the boy best offered a different. He pointed out that the boy and the girl had known about her headaches for a long time, and suggested that the boy had taken that one real fact and wrapped a lie around it, using a single truth to make a cruel falsehood sound convincing, all in order to drive the girl away for reasons of his own. By this reading, her love was entirely genuine, and the talk of instinct was a manipulation. The series presents both possibilities and then steps back, leaving the question hanging. It is one of the threads the story chooses not to tie shut, and any honest account has to admit that the truth of the girl's heart is left for the audience to weigh rather than handed down as fact. Even the broader question of how much of the Ackerman's skill came from their blood and how much from their own effort is left with soft edges. The man and the girl both trained relentlessly and survived more horror than most people could imagine, and it is impossible to draw a clean line between the strength they were given and the strength they earned. The story seems content to leave that line blurred, suggesting that the bloodline opened a door, but that the people themselves still had to walk through it. What stands clear at the end of it all is a quiet kind of irony. The Ackermans were engineered to be loyal servants, a weapon shaped to protect a king and obey without question. Yet the same blood that made them obedient also made them impossible to control, immune to the mind rewriting that kept everyone else in line, and willing to refuse a ruler whose vision they could not accept. A clan built to be the perfect instrument became the one group that could not be commanded, and for that they were nearly destroyed. The 2 who survived carried that contradiction in their veins, a strength meant for servitude that had become, in them, the strength to choose for themselves. The sword the Empire forged outlived the Empire, and in the end it answered to no king at all. That hidden true king the clan had once served was no fairy tale. He belonged to a family that had ruled the island from the shadows for 100 years, holding the greatest power in the world, while letting a false royal house sit on the visible throne in their place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A clan built to serve the throne became the one bloodline that could not be ruled, surviving in just 2 people who fought like no human should. Yet the throne they once guarded was itself a careful illusion, with the true royal family hidden away, ruling an entire people from behind a stolen crown. Section 8. The hidden kings behind the throne. A kingdom is supposed to have a king, and the people inside the walls believed they had one. There was a royal family seated on the visible throne, a line that carried the old name of Fritz, and the population gave them the respect owed to monarchs. Yet for the entire 100 years the wall stood. That throne was a piece of theater. The figures who sat on it held no real power and knew none of the great secret. They were a decoy, a comfortable lie placed in plain sight so that the true rulers could work unseen. The actual masters of the island lived quietly among the nobility, holding the most dangerous power in the world and reshaping the minds of an entire people whenever they judged it necessary. The question of who really ruled the walls has an answer, and that answer is a family almost no one had ever heard of. When the old king brought his people to the island and built the walls, he did more than hide his nation from the world. He hid himself from his own subject. He set up a false royal house to occupy the public throne and bear the public name, while he and his true descendants took a new surname and slipped into the background as ordinary if wealthy landowner. That new name was Rhys. From then on, the Rice family were the genuine royal line, the keepers of the founding titan and the inheritors of the dead king's will, while the visible Fritz monarchy ruled over nothing but appearances. The deception was total. A people lived for a century under a king who was a hollow stand-in, never suspecting that their real rulers walked among the nobles, smiling and silent, carrying a weapon that could level the world. The Race family kept the founding titan within their bloodline through the same grim ritual that governed all the titan powers. Deep beneath their land lay a hidden underground chapel, a cavern fitted out like a place of worship, and it was there that the power passed from one Rice to the next. When a holder neared the end of their 13 years, the chosen heir would consume them, taking the founding titan into their own body along with the accumulated memories of every king who had carried it before. The cavern was the secret heart of the kingdom, a place where the most important inheritance in the world changed hands away from every watching eye. The people praying in the churches above had no idea that the true seat of power lay buried in the earth beneath their feet. Holding the founding titan came at a steep spiritual cost for the Rhys line, because every one of them carried royal blood. The moment a Rice inherited the power and connected to it fully, the will of the old king poured into them, and the vow-renouncing war seized their hearts. They became like their ancestor, incapable of using the power for war or freedom, compelled instead toward the same quiet acceptance of suffering that Karl Fritz had chosen. This is what made them such reliable keepers of the secret. They could not turn the founding titan against the world, even if they wished to, and so they fell naturally into the role of guardian, maintaining the order their ancestor had built, rather than breaking it. The power they held was, in a sense, holding them. What they did use the founding titan for was the steady, ongoing work of keeping their people ignorant. The false history, the forgotten world beyond the sea, the erased knowledge of what the walls were made of, all of it had to be maintained. Memories have a way of leaking back, and so the Rice holders periodically reached into the minds of the population to keep the lie intact, smoothing over anything that threatened to surface. An entire civilization was managed this way. Its collective memory tended like a garden by a family it did not know existed. The people inside the walls were not simply they were kept in a lie that was actively renewed by the hidden hands of their true rulers. The holder of the founding titan in the years before the main story was a young woman of the Rice family named Frida. By the accounts the story offers, Frida was gentle and warm, the kind of person who genuinely cared for others, and she carried the burden of the power as best she could, even as the old king's will worked on her. She had a younger half-sister, a girl born outside the family's proper lines, and Frida would slip away to visit this child, showing her a tenderness the girl received from almost no one else. There was a cruelty woven even into that kindness, though. Protect the family's secrets, the memories of those visits were wiped from the little sister's mind afterward, so that the girl grew up with only the faintest dreamlike sense that someone had once been kind to her, unable to hold on to the face or the warmth. Before Frida, the power had been held by an older member of the family, and that earlier holder had been served and guarded by the feared Ackerman killer, a last thread of the old warrior clan still tied to the throne it once protected. That younger half-sister is one of the most important people in the entire story, though she begins it as one of the most overlooked. She was the illegitimate daughter of the head of the Rice family, born of an affair and treated as an embarrassment, hidden away on a remote farm and largely ignored by the father who had brought her into being. To survive in a world that had no place for her, she learned to disappear behind a false self, adopting a borrowed name and a sweet, harmless personality that drew no attention and asked for nothing. For a long stretch of the story, she is simply a quiet, kind girl among the soldiers, easy to like and easy to forget. Almost no one, including the audience, suspects that this neglected child carries the true royal blood of the island in her veins, the blood that could unlock the founding titan itself. Her name was Historia. The hidden order the Rice family had maintained for 100 years was shattered in a single night of violence, and the man who shattered it was the doctor who had crossed the sea. Grisha Jaeger, carrying the attack titan and the mission given to him by the ally who sent him over the walls, made his way to the secret underground chapel where the Rice family kept their power. There, in that buried cavern, he did something monstrous in pursuit of what he believed was the only path to his people's. He attacked the gathered Rice family and slaughtered them, including the gentle young woman who held the founding titan. By killing and consuming the holder, he tore the founding titan out of the royal bloodline that had guarded it for a century and took it into himself, now carrying 2 of the 9 powers at once. The true royal line, the hidden kings of the island, were wiped out in the dark in a matter of minutes, and the most important power in the world changed hands in a way no one had thought possible. Grisha did not keep what he had stolen for long. He carried the Founding Titan and the Attack Titan back to his home, and there, in an act that would define the entire series, he passed both powers to his young son. He injected the boy, turned him briefly into a mindless Titan, and had him consume his own father, transferring both inheritances into the child before dying himself. In that moment, the greatest power in the world came to rest inside an ordinary boy from the outer wall, a boy with no royal blood at all, who had no idea what now lived inside him. The implications of that, the loophole it created, had already been laid out in earlier section, but it began here, in a basement, with a father feeding himself to his son. One member of the Rice family had survived the massacre in the chapel. The father of the hidden daughter, the patriarch of the line, had not been present that night, and he was left as the last true royal with the knowledge of everything. He spent the following years consumed by a single goal: to reclaim the Founding Titan that had been stolen from his family. His plan was as desperate as it was cold. Since the power now lived inside the boy, the only way to bring it back into the Rice bloodline was to have a royal consume the boy and take it. He intended his hidden daughter to be the one to do it, to become a Titan, devour the boy, and restore the family's control over the island and its terrible weapon. He had spent her whole life ignoring her, and now he meant to use her as the instrument of his ambition. The daughter refused. In the moment she was meant to surrender her own will and become the family's tool, she chose instead to reject the role that had been forced on her and to stand on her own. Her father, robbed of his plan and unwilling to accept the loss, turned to the only option left to him. In his desperation, he took a Titan serum into his own body and transformed himself, but rather than an intelligent giant, he became an enormous, malformed, mindless creature, the largest pure Titan the story ever shows, a vast crawling mass that began to drag itself toward a nearby town full of people. The soldiers fought to stop it, and in the end it was the hidden daughter, the neglected child the family had cast aside, who struck the final blow against the monster her father had become. With that act, she stepped fully into the light, claiming her place not as a tool or a secret, but as the true and rightful queen of the walls, the first real ruler the island had openly known in 100 years. So the hidden kings behind the throne came to their end. The Rice family, who had ruled in shadow, tended a kingdom of lies, and guarded the Founding Titan through a century of silence, were undone in a single bloody night and a single desperate transformation. The power they had hoarded passed out of their bloodline entirely, into a boy who was never meant to hold it. And the last of their line, the daughter they had hidden and used, survived them all to become a queen who had chosen her own crown rather than inheriting one in secret. The throne that had been a decoy for 100 years finally held someone real. That boy now carried the Founding Titan and the Attack Titan together, and it was the second of those powers, the Attack Titan, that hid the most unsettling secret of all, a power that did not only fight, but could reach across time itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The true kings ruled from the shadows until a single night of slaughter ended their secret reign and handed their power to a boy who was never meant to hold it. Yet one of the powers now inside him reached beyond strength entirely, into memory and time, letting him glimpse a future that may have already decided everything. Section 9. The Titan that could see through time of all the powers scattered out of Ymir's body when her daughters consumed her. 8 of them followed the same basic rule when came to memory. A holder could look backward, through the unseen network of the paths, the great web that links every descendant of Ymir across distance and across death. An inheritor gained access to the memories of those who had carried the power before them. Fragments of past lives, old griefs, distant battles, faces long dead, all of it could surface in the mind of a new holder as though it were their own. This was strange enough on its own, the dead reaching forward into the thoughts of the living, whispering across centuries. For most of the 9 powers, that was the limit. Memory flowed in one direction, from the past toward the present, the way water flows downhill. What had already happened could be remembered. What had not yet happened was, sensibly, a blank. One of the 9 powers broke even this rule, and it broke it in a direction no one expected and few could even imagine. The Attack Titan could not only see backward, it could see forward. Its holders could receive the memories of those who would hold the power after them, of people who had not yet been born, of events that had not yet occurred and would not occur for years or even decades. A power that could remember the future sits at the center of the most disturbing idea in the entire series, and once it is understood, it quietly reshapes the meaning of nearly everything that came before it. Scenes that once seemed driven by rage or grief take on a different and colder weight. Choices that looked free begin to look like steps along a path already walked. To understand the final movements of the story, this strange power has to be understood first, slowly and carefully, because it changes the nature of choice itself within the world of the walls. The Attack Titan had a character unlike any of the others, and that character ran deeper than its ability. Across its long history, every one of its holders had shared one driving trait, a relentless and almost unbearable hunger for freedom. The power seemed to carry that hunger forward through its line of bearers, a will that refused to be caged, passing from one holder to the next like an inherited fire that never went out. Where other titans were defined by armor or by size or by some particular weapon their bodies could form, the attack titan was defined by a direction. It always pressed forward. It always strained against whatever held it. It always moved freedom, no matter the cost, and no matter who stood in the way. The name it carried reflected this, the sense of something perpetually advancing, never content to stand still or to be contained. That single-minded drive sat at the core of the power, and it would come to matter enormously by the end of the story. But that the trait that makes this section possible is the stranger one, the quiet fracture in how the power related to time. Somewhere in its nature, the Attack on Titan was loosened from the ordinary flow of past and future that bound everyone else. The first hint of this came long before anyone in the story could possibly understand it, in a quiet and chilling moment buried in the backstory of the doctor who crossed the sea. The man who held the Attack Titan before that doctor, the hidden ally who had buried himself inside the enemy's ranks and worked for years to free his people, said something just before he handed his inheritance, and what he said should have been impossible. As he urged the doctor to start a family inside the walls, to fall in love, and protect the people he would come to care for, he spoke two names. He named a girl and he named a boy, telling the doctor to look after them both. The difficulty is plain once it is noticed. Those two children would not be born for years. This dying man had no connection to them, no way of knowing them, no reason on earth to have their names in his mouth. And yet he spoke them gently, as though they were already real to him, as though he had met them somewhere. He had. He had received their names through the Attack Titan, glimpses bleeding backward from holders who would not exist until long after his own death. The girl and the boy he named would one day be cherished by the very children he was speaking to, in a future he himself would never live to see. At the time, this played as a small and eerie detail, easy to pass over, the kind of strange line that might be a mistake or a coincidence. Only much later did its full weight settle into place. The power had been leaking the future into the past the entire time, a slow seep of things to come surfacing in the minds of people who could not yet make sense of them. The dying man had simply been one more vessel through which the future flowed backward, repeating names that meant nothing to him and everything to the boy who would one day carry the same power. The moment this ability truly entered the heart of the story arrived when the boy who carried the Attack Titan touched the hand of the hidden royal daughter during a ceremony. That single contact, royal blood meeting the power he held, opened something in him that could never again be closed. In a sudden flood, he received the memories of his own future self, and what poured into him changed him completely and permanently. He glimpsed the whole shape of what was to come. He saw the great catastrophe he would one day unleash upon the world. He saw the staggering toll it would take, the scale of the death, the ruins spread across the land beyond the sea. And somewhere in that vision, folded into all the rest, he saw his own death waiting for him at the end of it. From that moment forward, the boy was no longer simply living his life one day at a time the way everyone else. He was living toward a future he had already witnessed, carrying inside him the knowledge of events that had not yet happened, watching the present unfold along lines he had seen drawn in advance. The change in him after that point is something the story shows rather than explains, and it is quietly heartbreaking once the cause is. The boy who had been loud and hot-tempered and full of simple fury in the early chapters grew distant, heavy, and strange. He pulled away from people who loved him. He carried himself like someone bearing an enormous and invisible weight, because that is exactly what he was doing. He had been shown the man he would become and the thing he would do, and he could not share that vision with anyone, and he could not unsee it. Every ordinary moment after that, every meal shared with friends, every quiet day inside the walls, was lived by someone who already knew how it all ended, and who could feel himself moving steadily toward it. This is where the most unsettling idea in the entire series takes its full shape, and it is worth moving through slowly, because it bends the mind in a way few stories ever attempt. The Attack Titan allowed its holder to send memories backward in time. That single fact, followed to its conclusion, breaks the ordinary order of cause and effect. If the future can reach into the past and shape it, then the past unfolds toward a future that has, in a real sense, already happened. The boy acted on the things he had seen, but the things he had seen were the results of his own action. His choices created the future, and that future then reached backward to inform the very choices that created it, folding cause and effect into a closed circle with no clear beginning and no clear end. Events occurred because they had already occurred. The boy moved forward through his life, carrying out the deeds he had glimpsed, and by carrying them out, he made the glimpses true. There was no single point along that loop where it could be said to start. It simply turned endlessly, each part holding up every other part. The clearest and most painful demonstration of this loop came in the way the boy reached back to manipulate his own father. Long before the main story, the doctor who had crossed the sea was an ordinary man with limits to what he was willing to do. He hesitated, he shrank from the worst act. And yet, in the end, he carried out a massacre, slaughtering the hidden royal family in their underground chapel and tearing the founding titan out of the bloodline that had guarded it. What pushed him to do it was not entirely his own resolve. Through the strange reach of the power, the boy, from his place in the future, was able to influence his father across time, pressing him forward at the crucial moment, steering him toward the terrible act that would eventually place both powers inside the boy himself. When the truth of this finally surfaced, the boy admitted plainly that he had manipulated his father, that the father's darkest deed had been shaped by the son who did not yet exist when it happened. The doctor, in his final moments, had even seemed to sense a presence guiding him, a hand from somewhere he could not name. That hand belonged to his own child, reaching back through the loop to make sure the past arrived at the future it was meant to. There is a still darker example, and it is the one that fully reveals how completely the boy was bound to the circle he was both creating and trapped inside. On the day the walls first fell, a wandering titan reached the boy's childhood home and killed his mother before his eyes, lifting her from the rubble and devouring her while he was carried away. For most of the story, this was simply the founding tragedy of his life, the senseless cruelty that set him on his path of rage. The truth, revealed near the very end, is almost too heavy to absorb. That particular titan had been close to a different target, close to one of the very enemies who had broken the walls, and it could easily have gone that way instead. But the boy from the future, using the power he would one day hold, reached back and commanded that creature to ignore the enemy and turn toward his own mother. He sent the monster to his own mother. He arranged the death that would shape his entire life, because in the future he had seen that death had already happened, and the loop demanded that it happen again. The full reasons behind such an unthinkable act belong to the final section of this story, where the whole design is laid bare. But the mechanism is here in the time-bending nature of the attack titan. The boy did not merely witness his mother's death. He caused it from years away to keep the future intact. This is the point where the story plants its deepest and most uncomfortable question, and it is fair to be honest that the story never fully answers. The attack titan was the titan of freedom. Its every holder burned with the desire to be free, to break every chain, to advance without limit. And yet the boy who held it may have been the least free person in the entire tale. He had seen the future. He moved toward it knowing exactly what. Every step he took seemed to be a step he had already taken in the vision, a line already drawn that he was merely tracing. He could see the cage, and the cage was time itself, and he walked into it with his eyes open because he had already watched himself do so. The Titan of Freedom carried a holder who may have had no freedom at all, only the appearance of it, only the motions of a man choosing what was never truly open to be chosen. The boy himself seemed unable to resolve this contradiction within his own heart, and his confusion is part of what makes the question so haunting. At times he spoke as though he had chosen everything freely, as though the catastrophe was an expression of his own deepest will, the act of a man doing exactly what he wanted with no apology. At other times he spoke as though he had been dragged forward by the memories, pulled along a path he could not step off, compelled by the future he had seen into making that future real. Both of these cannot be entirely true at once, and yet the story lets them both stand, refusing to choose between them. It is genuinely left unsettled whether the boy was the author of his fate or its prisoner, whether the loop was something he willed into being or something that simply used him as its instrument. Any honest account of this has to admit that the series presents the contradiction deliberately and then declines to dissolve it, leaving the audience to sit with the discomfort rather than handing down a clean verdict. The implications stretch out beyond the boy alone, and this is what makes the power so quietly terrifying once its full reach is felt. If the future was fixed, and if the boy had seen it and moved toward it without deviation, then a shadow falls over every event in the story that led to that future. The desperate plans of the soldiers, the betrayals, the alliances, the deaths, the small private choices of people who believed they were deciding their own lives, all of it begins to look like motion along tracks that had already been. Perhaps the people of the walls were free, struggling and choosing in a world full of open doors. Or perhaps they were figures in a vision the boy had already watched to its end, acting out roles that could not have gone any other way, because in the future that reached back to shape them, they had already done exactly these things. The story holds both readings in its hands and presses neither, and that refusal is itself a kind of answer, an admission that the question of free will is one the tale would rather leave breathing than bury. What can be said with certainty is that the attack titan recolors the boy's entire journey. The fury that drove him in the early chapters, the simple cry of a child who wanted to destroy the monsters that took his mother, was never quite as simple as it appeared. Beneath it, from the moment he touched that royal hand, ran the slow, cold current of foreknowledge. He knew where he was going. He had seen the ruin at the end of the road, and he walked toward it anyway, day after day, smiling sometimes, suffering often, carrying a secret that no one around him could have guessed. The boy who seemed to live for freedom was in truth the most bound figure the story ever produced, chained not by a wall or a vow or a bloodline, but by a vision of his own making, a future that had already happened and that he could not refuse to bring about. So the most unsettling power in the series turns out not to be a power of strength at all. It is a loop in time, a circle in which cause and effect chase each other without beginning, a quiet machinery that may have trapped not only one boy, but everyone whose life touched his. The Attack Titan could level cities and break armies, but its true horror lay in something gentler and far more frightening, the capacity to know the future, and in knowing it, to be compelled to create it. Everything the story had built toward, the walls and the bloodline, the hidden kings and the sleeping army, now bent toward a single design carried inside one young man who had already seen how it would end. What that design truly was, why he chose it or was forced into it, and what it finally cost the world is the last thread left to follow, and it pulls everything together at once. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A power that could remember the future folded the whole story into a circle, leaving one boy to walk knowingly toward a ruin he had already seen. All that remains is the design itself, the plan he carried in silence, the army he finally woke, and the long sorrow that brought the Age of Titans to its end. Section 10. The plan and how the Titans finally ended everything the story had built across 2,000 years of history now narrowed toward a single point, and that point was a young man who had already seen how it would end. The boy who carried the Attack Titan and the Founding Titan together had spent years moving quietly toward a design he kept locked inside himself, smiling sometimes, suffering often, letting the people closest to him believe he was simply lost or changed. He was not lost. He was waiting, gathering the pieces he needed, walking the path he had glimpsed when he touched the royal daughter's hand. The plan was never only the rage of a grieving child. It was something colder, larger, and far sadder, and when it finally unfolded, it brought the entire Age of Titans crashing to its close. The first piece the plan required was the full power of the Founding Titan, and that power had a lock on it that no scheme could pick by force. As the earlier sections explained, the Founding Titan could only be unlocked through royal blood, yet royal blood bound its holder to the dead king's vow of peace. The boy carried no royal blood himself, which left him free of that vow but also unable to reach the deepest power on his own. He needed contact with someone of the royal line, someone whose blood could light the fuse while his own will stayed entirely his. That someone was his older half-brother, a man who carried royal blood through their shared connection to the ancient bloodline. The two of them met not in the waking world but inside the paths, the timeless place at the center of everything, where the boy was meant to make contact with that royal blood and finally open the power he had been carrying in silence for so long. The half-brother had a plan of his own, and it pulled in the opposite direction. Having spent his life watching his people suffer under endless hatred, he had come to believe that the only mercy left was to end the subjects of Ymir entirely. His idea was to use the Founding Titan to take away their ability to have children, so that the bloodline would simply fade out over a single generation, dying peacefully, rather than continuing the long cycle of war and cruelty. To carry this out, he reached for the ancient girl who stood at the heart of the paths and commanded her, the way the royal bloodline had commanded her for 2,000 years, to sterilize all Eldian. For a moment, it seemed the future would belong to him. The boy refused to let it. He tore himself free of his brother's grip, breaking out of the hold that bound him within the paths, and he ran toward the girl at the center of everything before his brother's command could take hold. What he did when he reached her is the quiet hinge on which the entire ending turns, and it had nothing to do with power or force. For 2,000 years, the ancient girl had been ordered, used, and commanded by everyone who held her bloodline. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. No one had ever treated her as anything other than a tool, first in life, and then through 20 centuries of labor in the path. The boy did not command her. He spoke to her as a person. He asked for her help rather than demanding it, and he offered her the one thing she had never once been given, the freedom to choose for herself what would happen next. The reason this mattered so much reaches back to the girl's own buried heart, and the story reveals it here at last, though it keeps the edges soft. For 2,000 years, she had remained in service to the royal bloodline, building the bodies of titans without rest, obeying without question, and the deepest reason for this was a wound the story names only carefully. She had been bound to the king, who enslaved her by something twisted into the shape of love, a hopeless devotion to the very man who had owned and broken her, a bond she could not release on her own. She had waited, without fully knowing she was waiting, for something that could finally show her how to let that love go. When the boy treated her as free, for the first time in her endless existence, she considered her own will, and she made a choice. She chose to side with him. The girl who had served for 2,000 years finally acted for herself, and what she chose was to help him bring the world to ruin. With her help, the boy reached the full depth of the Founding Titan's power, and the threat that had loomed over the entire story for 100 years stopped being a threat and became real. The millions of colossal titans sealed inside the walls. The gray rings cracked open along their whole length, and the faces that had slept for a century lifted their heads, stepped out of the stone, and began to walk. Led forward by the boy's own enormous skeletal titan, that endless tide of giants marched out across the land beyond the sea. Over the course of roughly 4 days, the rumbling rolled across the world, the giants' bodies flattening cities, crushing armies, and trampling everything in their path. By the time it was checked, Something close to 8 in every 10 people living beyond the island had been killed. The doomsday the old king had buried as a bluff, the weapon no royal could ever bring themselves to fire, had finally been unleashed by the one person free enough to give the order. The reasons the boy did this are where the story refuses to offer a single clean answer, and any honest account has to sit with that. When he finally explained himself to his oldest friend in a long and aching conversation within the paths, his motives came out in layers that did not fully fit together, and the story seems to intend that they should not. On one level, he did it to protect his home and the people he loved. By breaking the outside world so thoroughly, he meant to leave the island safe for the rest of his friends' lives, and he arranged for those friends to be the ones who stopped him, so that they would be remembered as the heroes who saved what remained of humanity, earning enough goodwill to keep the island protected after he was gone. On another level, he did it to end the curse of the Titans entirely, through a chain of events that depended on a single choice yet to be made. And on a third level, beneath both of those, he admitted something harder to forgive and harder to explain. Part of him simply wanted to do it. The drive toward freedom that lived in the attack titan, the hunger to see everything open and unbound, had become tangled with his own will until he could no longer separate them. And he confessed that he would have carried out the rumbling regardless of any reason, because some part of him wanted to see the world flattened and could not say exactly why. These motives sit uneasily against one another on purpose. The boy was a planner who saw the future and engineered it with terrible precision, and at the same time a young man swept along by a compulsion he did not understand, dragged forward by the loop of time described in the previous section. The story does not reconcile these into a tidy whole. It lets the contradiction stand, leaving it genuinely open how much of what he did was chosen, and how much was simply the future making itself true through him. The grimmest proof of how completely he had committed to the path was the truth about his own mother. As revealed earlier, he had reached back through time and sent the wandering titan toward her on the day the walls fell, arranging the death that shaped his whole life, because in the future he had seen that death had already happened, and the loop demanded it occur again. A man who would engineer his own mother's death to keep the timeline intact was not a man who had left himself any way out. He had closed every door behind him long before the rumbling. The world that remained did not simply lie down and die. Out of the wreckage rose an alliance unlike anything the story had shown before, made of people who had spent the entire series trying to kill one another. The boy's oldest friends stood alongside the very enemies who had broken the walls, former warriors and former soldiers fighting side by side, united by the single goal of stopping the giants and saving what was left of humanity. The clash that followed came to be remembered as the Battle of Heaven and Earth, and it was a desperate, costly thing. The Alliance threw everything it had against the boy and his marching host. His royal-blooded brother allowed himself to be killed in the fighting, and that death briefly stalled the giants, forcing them to pause. In the opening that created, one of the boy's old comrades detonated a charge against his neck, blowing apart his titan form and forcing out into the open the strange worm-like creature that had bonded with the ancient girl 2,000 years before, the source of all living matter itself, exposed at last. His thoughtful friend turned into a giant of his own and hurled himself at the creature in an effort to destroy both it and the boy together. The boy reformed in a new and stranger shape to continue, and the creature released a gas that turned the surrounding people into titans to defend it, fighting to reconnect with the boy and keep the power alive. In the middle of that chaos, the adopted sister who had loved the boy since childhood made her way through the carnage toward the place where his true self could be reached, the small human core hidden within the monstrous form. What she did there was the act the ancient girl had waited 2,000 years to witness. The sister had spent her whole life devoted to the boy, her loyalty so total that he had once cruelly suggested it was nothing but the instinct of her bloodline. Now facing the person she loved most in the world, knowing that he had become the engine of an unimaginable slaughter, she chose to end him. She reached him, and she killed him, taking his head with her own hands, and she kissed him as she did it, holding both her love and her choice in the same unbearable moment. That single choice was the key. The ancient girl at the center of the paths had remained bound for 2,000 years because she could not let go of her love for the king who had broken her, and she had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to show her that it was possible to love a person completely and still choose to release them, to kill the one you cherish most, and step into freedom rather than stay chained by the bond. The sister's choice was exactly that demonstration. Watching it, the ancient girl finally understood how to separate her own self from the person she loved. She let go of the king at last. She smiled, for perhaps the first time in the whole long story, and with that release, her 2,000-year servitude came to its end. The moment the girl was freed, the entire foundation of the Titans collapsed. The link binding the girl, the boy, and the source of all living matter was severed, and with it, the power that had flowed for 2,000 years simply ceased. Every Titan in the world, the marching giants of the rumbling and the transformed people of the battlefield alike, turned to dust and steam. Everyone who had been a Titan or a shifter and still lived was returned to human form. their giant bodies falling away. The curse of Ymir, the 13-year death sentence, the endless cycle of devouring and inheritance, all of it ended at once and forever. There would be no more Titan. The power that had defined the world since a hunted slave girl fell beneath a tree was gone, carried out of existence along with the freedom of the girl who had started it. The boy died in his sister's arms, his head cradled by the person who had loved him and chosen to end him. Before the battle, in their final talk within the paths, he had taken the memory of their conversation from his oldest friend so that it would not interfere with what had to happen. And that friend recovered the memory only after the boy was dead, understanding too late the full weight of what his friend had carried and done. The survivors gathered the boy's remains and carried him to a place he had loved, a great tree standing alone on a hill, and there they buried his head beneath its roots. The sister, who had worn his scarf since the day he saved her as a child, knelt at the grave with her grief. The final images of the story hold both peace and warning, and they refused to settle into simple comfort. A small bird came to the sister at the grave and wrapped her scarf more snugly around her neck, an echo of the boy who had once done exactly that. The bird, carrying a gentle suggestion of the freedom his spirit had always chased. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself, the island and the wider lands finding an uneasy new shape now that the Titans were gone. And the lone tree on the hill, where the boy was buried, slowly grew, until in time it came to resemble another tree from the very beginning of the story, the great tree beneath which the slave girl had first met the strange creature and become the first Titan. That resemblance is no accident, and the story plants it deliberately as a quiet unease. The power may have ended, but the shape of the world that produced it lingered, and the cycle of conflict that had driven everything showed signs of turning once more, the same hatreds finding new forms even in a world without giant. The Age of Titans was over, yet the deeper sickness that birthed it was not so easily buried, and the story closes on that bittersweet doubt rather than a clean triumph, leaving the final meaning of it all for each person to weigh. So the long story that began with a hunted girl and a creatures beneath a tree ended with another girl, freed after 2,000 years, finally able to let go of a love that had enslaved her. Between those two moments lay the walls, the giants, the bloodlines, the hidden kings, the time-bending power, and a boy who saw the whole of it in advance and walked toward it anyway, paying with his life and the lives of millions to break a curse that had held the world for 20 centuries. The Titans were gone, the girl was free. The cost had been almost beyond measure, and the peace it bought was fragile and uncertain. What remained in the end was a quiet hill, a growing tree, and a grave, and the long memory of everything it had taken to reach them. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.